Social security numbers, birth dates, personal medical information, all found on the side of a road. A viewer sent us pictures of what he found in St. Johns County, and he wanted to know how it got there and who was responsible. Tonight, we're on your side investigating. Papers scattered everywhere.
Piece after piece after piece of the exact same thing. Truly insanity.
This is what our viewer Andrew, who asked we not use his last name, spotted when he was driving down Racetrack Road near Durbin Park Pavilion.
I pulled up to the stoplight there, and there's thousands of pieces of paper blowing in the wind.
Andrew stepped out of his car and was shocked by what he saw. He found prescription bags with patients' names, documents listing their medical conditions, even a picture of an older man with his name on it.
And the first piece of paper I looked at had a person's name, their date of birth, social security number, address, the pharmacy's information, the nursing home information, the medication they were prescribed, the dosage they were prescribed on one piece of paper.
Andrew called the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office to report what he had found. A spokesman says that the deputy dispatched to the scene didn't find anything when he arrived. But days later, across the street in the bushes, look at what's still here. Documents full of personal information. They trace back to a luxury senior living community in Jacksonville.
The pharmacy name on everything is Guardian Pharmacy. So I called and spoke with a pharmacist there, and she confirmed that Harbor Chase in Mandarin was the assisted living facility that basically all this came from.
We reached out to Harbor Chase of Mandarin to ask how all of this sensitive information ended up on the side of the road. The administrator told us the pharmacy notified them that the documents had been found. Because they were discovered miles away from their facility, she said they are now investigating their shredding company, but declined to name it. The pharmacy says it had nothing to do with the documents being exposed.
If the shredding company was properly handling the documents, this never could have happened.
Attorney Sean Cronin says the release of federally protected patient health information without their consent can carry hefty fines, up to $50,000 per occurrence.
And they're entitled to federal protection under the HIPAA rules, the HIPAA privacy rules.
The information in these scattered documents is enough for an identity thief to do a lot of damage. We tried unsuccessfully to reach the families of numerous patients, some of whom recently died.
My loved one was in that facility. I would be checking their credit scores and making sure no one is opening credit on their behalf.
Andrew just hopes that the information did not fall into the wrong hands.
My ultimate reaction was, my good Lord, somebody's about to be in a lot of trouble, because that should not be spread along the side of the road.
We reached out to the Agency for Healthcare Administration, which oversees Florida's long-term care facilities. A spokeswoman told us they would look into it.
I mean, the fact that this is just strewn amongst the weeds in the highway obviously is unacceptable, but the real question is how did that get there? How is that not shredded? How is that not incinerated? How is that much personal information end up on the side of the road and nobody knows about it?
Now, the Department of Health and Human Services, which investigates HIPAA violations, says it does not comment on open or potential investigations. But under federal law, any facility that handles personal medical information is required to notify individuals affected by a security breach. Harbor Chase of Mandarin says it did notify residents and families, and an active investigation is underway. Now, a statement sent to First Coast News today says that Harbor Chase contracts with a third-party vendor to dispose of materials containing sensitive resident and company data. All materials recovered were items that were disposed of through the proper procedure and sent out for destruction through the third-party vendor. And you can read the full statement on firstcoastnews.com.